Oh, hi! You caught me managing all my pills because I'm so old. Speaking of old, let's talk about the platinum age of comics.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello! Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Superman debuted in 1938, ushering in the golden age of comic books. But of course, if we look at comic books as a whole, of course they didn't emerge fully formed at that point in time. There was an age before the golden age of comic books when comic books were brand new and they were introducing the conventions that would become part of comic books. We're talking about things like panel-to-panel storytelling and word balloons to identify dialogue coming from characters. This is the stuff I want to talk about today. It's an age when America could not get enough comics, and it even launched a war of sorts between two wealthy newspaper magnates. Let's talk today about the Platinum Age of comics. Leading up to the Platinum Age of comics was the so-called Victorian Age of comics from 1884 through 1896. British and American illustrators created caricatures and cartoons like Journey to the Gold Diggins by Jeremiah Saddlebags. Satirical magazines carried these strips in titles like Puck, Judge, and Life. But these magazines were too expensive to reach the masses. In America, early comic strips were exclusively published in newspapers as supplements. The new printing techniques emerging made newspapers cheap to produce and to distribute. Newspapers were the most widely distributed form of news as the century came to a close, making publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer very wealthy, powerful, and influential men. In 1887, Hearst took over managing his father's newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, which had been acquired 7 years earlier as repayment of a gambling debt. Hearst hired the best writers of the time like Mark Twain and Jack London, and also political cartoonist Homer Davenport. Hearst's rises and falls in fortune would later be the main inspiration for Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane.
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this...
In 1895, Hearst bought the New York Morning Journal, retitling it the New York Journal, and began competing head-to-head with the popular New York World, run by Joseph Pulitzer. Joseph Pulitzer was a poor Jewish immigrant from Hungary who came to America at age 17 as a recruit in Massachusetts to be a soldier in the Civil War. After the war, he became a successful reporter and began buying newspapers. He married into a wealthy family and bought the struggling New York World in 1883. He turned it into a success by focusing on sensational stories, crime, war, and natural disasters. In 1895, Pulitzer hired artist Richard F. Outcault and introduced the popular comic strip The Yellow Kid. It would shortly debut in the new Sunday color pages and help the newspaper grow from a circulation of 15,000 to 600,000, making it the most popular newspaper in the world. But newspapers all covered the same information, so how would publishers gain a competitive edge over their competition? Well, two ways. One was provocative editorials, opinion pieces essentially. The second was to carry the best exclusive comics. And the most popular comic strip of all was The Yellow Kid, created by Richard F. Outcault. The Yellow Kid became popular in the pages of the New York World. In 1889, Pulitzer began publishing comics in the paper. In 1892, the Chicago Inter-Ocean debuted a 4-color insert, the first color in newspaper. Pulitzer saw this and instantly bought a 4-color press, and the World began including a color insert in spring of 1893. On September 16, 1894, a 6-panel, full-page comic strip by artist Richard Outcault debuted within the color insert. While it wasn't the first time multiple panels had been used to create a comic, it was among the earliest. The earliest multiple strip comic had come out in the early 1830s by Swiss artist Rudolf Topfer, but the technique wasn't common for decades to come. Richard Outcault was born in Lancaster, Ohio in 1863 and went to McKinnon University's School of Design in Cincinnati through 1881, becoming a painter for Edison Laboratories. He was their official artist for a traveling exhibition in 1889 through 1890 in Paris. At this time, he began contributing cartoons to magazines like Puck, Judge, Life, and Truth. A cartoon by Outcault from the June 2nd, 1894 issue of Judge featured a big-eared, bald street kid in a gown, who Outcault continued to include in his cartoons and would eventually evolve into becoming the Yellow Kid. The strip caught the attention of New York World's editors, and the character appeared in the World on January 13, 1895, in black and white, and in color pages in the May 5th issue of the World in Outcault's popular comic strip, Hogan's Alley. The comic strip was about the residents of a common New York slum. The Yellow Kid became the most popular character within the strip. His real name was Mickey Dugan, and he had a big smile and a shaved bald head, common at the time among poor people to avoid head lice. He wore a yellow nightshirt which would have his thoughts written out on them. The gag doesn't play as well today, but at the time it was satirizing the new trend of advertising billboards throughout the city. Yeah, apparently it was the height of comedy to talk about how billboards just had so many words all over them. I guess that was considered very, very funny back then. Maybe not so funny now. But what's important is that the Yellow Kid was very, very popular, and his comics were read by tons of people. It popularized a lot of elements that became important to comics. Things like color and word balloons. The idea of text coming from paintings and illustrations can be found in Mesoamerican art as far back as the 600s. It was not a common technique, but can also be found in late 18th century political cartoons, such as this one by Benjamin Franklin. It was the Yellow Kid comics that standardized the use of speech balloons, which were used almost from the beginning, even though a lot of Yellow Kid's thoughts also appeared on his shirt. The Yellow Kid was also popularizing the idea of using multiple panels to indicate a passage of time from image to image. The popularity of the Yellow Kid was such that Hearst decided to steal it away from his competitor Pulitzer. The Yellow Kid himself wasn't copyrighted though, so while Outcault released more violent and vulgar comics featuring the character in a strip now called McFadden Flats, Pulitzer hired cartoonist George Looks to continue drawing the now less popular original strips at his paper. For about a year, the two versions of Yellow Kid were published simultaneously. The Yellow Kid helped the newspaper sell, and he began to be used in all sorts of merchandising, from cigarettes to chewing gum to toys. The Yellow Kid came to represent the same kind of gross commercialism he was originally parodying with his shirt. Creator Richard Outcault tried multiple times to gain the copyright back, but it was held onto by the newspaper. So, by 1898, he lost interest and abandoned that strip. A year prior, a collection of Yellow Kid comics debuted in a collected edition called The Yellow Kid in McFadden's Flats. On the back cover, it called itself a comic book, the first known instance of that term. Some historians call it the first comic book for that reason, although others argue the case for a collected book from 1842, over 50 years earlier, called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. The Yellow Kid comic was 196 pages and sized at 5.5 inches by 7.5 inches. The Yellow Kid deserves a lot of credit for coming up with terms like comic book, for popularizing and standardizing techniques like panel-to-panel storytelling, word balloons, but it's also a little depressing to see that it set the tone for what would come later in the Golden Age, and that was the creator not getting the rights to his own creation, for seeing a company take ownership of that character and use it as a commercial mechanism for advertising things. That happened with Superman and Batman later. Perhaps that tone was set early on with the Yellow Kid. There's another thing that the Yellow Kid is noted for creating, and that is the term yellow journalism. Yellow journalism refers to sensationalistic writing, and certainly at the time, both the World and the Journal were writing sensational stories, they were also publishing Yellow Kid comics. So people began to refer to that as Yellow Kid journalism, and eventually that was shortened to Yellow journalism. And that wasn't the only negative thing to come out of the creation of the Yellow Kid. Censors began writing letters to the journal complaining about the new vulgarity and violence found within the Yellow Kid. The letters complained that the comics were influencing the children of the 1890s negatively. That may have also contributed to Outcalt walking away from his strip, as he did not argue with them about the content. In 1902, he created a new popular comic strip, Buster Brown. It followed a naughty boy dressed in Little Lord Fauntleroy clothes, but the strip was overall a lot more wholesome. Even though Yellow Kid went away, censors continued to complain. In 1908, the New York State Assembly of Mothers Clubs placed it on record that they condemned yellow journalism and the comics section of these newspapers. That was enough to influence some newspapers. The Boston Globe ceased publication of their comics, writing, "Comic supplements have ceased to be comic. They have become as vulgar in design as they are tawdry in color. There is no longer any semblance of art in them, and if there are any ideals, they are low and descending lower." That said, in 1908, when that was going on, about 75% of all newspapers were carrying comics. And by 1910, you could not find a newspaper that didn't carry comic strips. The fact was, censors may have been complaining, but wallets spoke louder. People loved comics, and they were here to stay. Every newspaper was introducing comic strips. The Yellow Kid was the first to use things like panels and word balloons and to be collected into books, but other similar comic strips would follow shortly. In 1905, Winsor McCay debuted the popular strip Little Nemo in Slumberland. That would introduce elements like a continuing story arc featuring Nemo journeying to Slumberland to visit Morpheus, the Lord of the Dreams, as well as McCay's experimental techniques with panel structure. Several reprints of comics like Mutt and Jeff and Bringing Up Father debuted at different dimensions in 1910 and 1919 respectively. In 1921, over in England, D.C. Thompson and Company released Adventure, a boys' adventure comic. Back in the U.S., in 1922, the first monthly comic book debuted, called Comics Monthly. It lasted 12 issues and featured a different comic strip character each month. Little Orphan Annie was a popular comic strip that was first published as a comic book in 1926. She was one of the earliest popular female characters in comics. Comics sold well, and every publisher wanted to get into them. Buck Rogers was a short story in a literary sci-fi magazine in 1928 and quickly became a popular ongoing comic strip the following year, leading to collections. In 1929, the comic book The Funnies debuted at a tabloid size. It was full color and was the first comic book to feature original stories instead of reprints. It was popular but lost money. Dell tried changing the price and content, but it ended with issue 36. Also in 1929, Tintin by Hergé debuted in Belgium, bringing popular full-color ongoing comic stories into vogue over in Europe. This was a true adventure comic that also included physical humor. Another popular character debuted that year who would mix adventure and comedy, Popeye the Sailor. Creator E.C. Seeger had been making the comic strip Thimble Theater about Olive Oyl and her brother Castor for 10 years before introducing Popeye, who quickly became the lead character. He was tough and supernaturally lucky, thanks to rubbing the head of the Wiffle Hen. Because of this nearly superhuman toughness, some historians think of Popeye as the first superhero, though he lacks the costume that many would argue is also a necessary component. In 1930, Joe Palooka debuted. He was a great boxer who didn't like to fight. He eventually joined the Army during World War II, which increased enlistment so much that President Roosevelt sent a thank you letter to the character and its creator, Ham Fisher. One of the last key books of the Platinum Age was More Fun Comics, which debuted in 1935. It featured original material instead of reprints and was published by National Allied Publications, which would eventually rename itself DC Comics. Over roughly 50 years, the Platinum Age of comics evolved and gave us the conventions of comics that we recognize today, things like word balloons, panel-to-panel storytelling, serialized stories, and even the term comic book. It may not be as exciting as the superheroes that debuted during the Golden Age or the creators' rights battles that were being fought during the Silver Age, but by understanding the Platinum Age of comics, it gives us a better understanding and therefore appreciation of the comic books that came later. Let's take a quick look at some fan art that came in this week, and then I'll close things out. JustinArt02 sent in this piece inspired by Akira. Bellin created this cute cartoon version of me. This surreal art was made by Nicholas Navia. Uncanny Comics drew this piece inspired by a famous Batman cover. Greg Reeves gave me some Kirby Crackle. You can see more on his website. Genevieve Gonzalez, her husband John, and their young son Rufus sent in some cool new logos. Kate H. sent in a cool animated GIF of me coloring. Heike Arge claims this artwork contains 99,999 dots to commemorate my crossing 100,000 subscribers. Vilal Pando illustrated me with the Joker. You can see more on Instagram. Danielle Garabana illustrated this piece based on my review of Captain America turning into a werewolf. Matthew Warby claims not to have drawn in 10 years, but still crafted this awesome artwork. Tyler Austin shows us all what happened when I met Mysterio. Johnny Michelson illustrated Rob Liefeld getting his revenge on me. A Incorporated shows a furry watching my show. A link to more art is included. Ben Griffin worked up this piece where I met Batman. Brett Kelly sent in two pieces by his kids. Chance drew me with superheroes and Grayson drew me with G.I. Joes. Pyro What's It To You created some art where I'm tied up by One Piece's Monkey D. Luffy. Folks, I'm always happy to feature fan art as long as it's directly related to comic tropes, and then after I show it, I will pick a random winner. I've got some balls representing each person that drew some artwork, and I'll pick out a Gachapon prize from the Gachapony machine that was donated by Lunar Shine Store. If you would like to have some artwork featured on the show, just make sure it has something to do with comic tropes and send it to this address, comictropes@gmail.com. All right, so let's spin the ball hopper here. I don't have a good place to put this. And I'll grab a number, see who won. Number 7. So that will be this artwork. And let's see what you won. Whoops, I just dropped the little ball on the floor. Well, I'll pick that up later. Let's take a quick look here. Oh my God, I love comic book history, folks. The Victorian and Platinum Age don't get discussed nearly enough, but there's so many comic strips there that I really could only briefly mention. The history of Popeye is absolutely fascinating. That's one that I absolutely love, and there's so many more great ones. All right, I'm trying to figure out exactly what this is. The camera's not going to focus very well, but it's something to do with Pikachu. It's some sort of Pikachu thing that you assemble. So anyway, I'll be sending that your way, number 7. Sorry, I can't remember all the art that was sent in this week. Anyway, the channel's doing very well. Please, if you would take a moment to hit like and subscribe, that really helps. I've decided on what my next goal is. We crossed 100,000. Hopefully I'll be getting that silver play button from YouTube soon. That's an accomplishment. I've decided that my next goal is to try to get about 10% of all my viewers. If I could get them to be patrons on my Patreon page, I could definitely do this full time. So that's basically my next goal is, even just $1, I'm saying. If even just 10% donated $1, I'd be doing terrific. 10%, I could probably even do with less, but 10% is basically my goal right now. That's my goal, is to try to encourage you guys. If you can just donate $1 a month, that would be huge. That would add up to a lot at this point. And so hopefully the channel keeps growing. I'd love to be able to do this full time, because if so, I could deliver more content regularly, which I would really like to do. It's definitely a struggle as it is, but it's a fun struggle. It's a good struggle, It's a lot of work to put this together, but it's work that I love doing. And I had a lot of fun. I don't know if the Platinum Age of Comics video here is going to reach a huge audience, but I have to do episodes that really interest me sometimes if I'm going to keep going. That said, I know that some of the ones I've got coming up are things that are going to excite all of you. I'm pretty sure that the one I'll do next week I'm pretty sure it's going to be really, really popular with a lot of you. So that's just a guess, but I think a lot of people have wanted it for a long time. Enough of me being a tease. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Until then, keep reading comics.